Hello and welcome to the first Additive Insight Industry Roundtable brought to you by TCT. I'm Laura Griffiths, TCT Head of Content, and today we're joined by three experts to discuss the potential for 3D printing in supply chain. Our panelists are Dr. Jennifer Johns, Reader in International Business at the School of Management at the University of Bristol in the UK. Jennifer also serves as academic advisor to Reshoring UK and the GTMA Trade Association. Jennifer, with colleagues in engineering at the university, has just secured a £1 million grant to develop a cloud-based distributed manufacturing system using 3D printing. We also have Ramon, HP's worldwide general manager of 3D printing. HP's jet fusion technology has been used everywhere from Volkswagen to Smile Direct Club and even inside its own machines. Last year, HP surveyed more than 2,000 manufacturing leaders about trends in digital manufacturing. 79% of respondents shared the idea that 3D printing could help make supply chains more agile. Rounding out our esteemed panel, we also have Sam Onukuri, Head of 3D Printing and Customer Solutions at Johnson & Johnson. In a recent interview with TCT, Sam shared how, as a global company operating across dynamic healthcare markets, there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach. At J&J's 3D Printing Centre of Excellence, various 3D printing technologies are being applied to develop, test and commercialise products much faster. Sam anticipates that 3D printing will be a mainstay of future supply chains. Throughout, you'll hear about lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, important considerations for 3D printing in supply chain, and the biggest opportunities for additive in increasing supply chain resilience. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and for more additive manufacturing insight, head over to tctmagazine.com where you can pick up your free copy of TCT and get the biggest 3D printing news stories delivered straight to your inbox every week. Okay, so let's dive in. Last year we saw an increase in conversation around the potential for additive manufacturing in supply chain. What have you learned about manufacturing supply chains and about the capabilities of 3D printing during the COVID-19 pandemic? Jennifer, I think we'll go to you first, as you spoke about this during your talk at the TCT conference at Formnext.
Yeah, thank you very much, Laura. I think some kind of big things struck me about what we've learned about manufacturing supply chains, particularly around additive manufacturing. And I think that's about the responsiveness of additive manufacturing in order to try and tackle these things. It was quite immediate, the community coming together and offering solutions to some of these quite extreme supply chain problems that were occurring, particularly around COVID. And I think we were aware that some supply chain problems might be coming because of Brexit, but I think the severity of COVID was really quite immediate and extreme. And I think we saw enthusiasm and a real drive to combat these problems. And traditionally, I see 3D printing at home as being kind of separate sometimes from industrial additive manufacturing. But in many senses, we've seen some coming together of those communities again, which I think also is suggestive of that move of cheaper desktop machines and industrial machines becoming more accessible to users. But on the flip side, I think that it's shown some of the issues around additive manufacturing that we all know exist. Problems of coordination, also quality, and the need for standards and communicating those standards across the community and also to the users of the items that are produced. So I wouldn't say it's a huge success story, but I think that I'm enthused and quite proud of the sector in terms of the response, but also quite cautious about some of the problems that still exist.
Okay. And Sam, as a user of the technology, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think 3D printing or additive manufacturing. Maybe just a little bit of a background about my company. Right, we are three different big segments blended in together. One is the med devices, the other one is the pharmaceuticals, and then the consumer health. 3D printing or the additive technology has been able to provide solutions in the supply chain across all three. So there was really a good advantage during the COVID times, especially when we had issues with PPEs, also with some of the sanitizer solutions, some of the vaccine development work. This technology, because of the fact that it is, a digital technology and we can be very agile about quickly connecting and creating product, really helped out the company and the customers mostly on bringing some of the solutions quickly to us, right? So one good example is during the early part of that last year during March, when the ventilator supply was really bad, There was one protocol around splitting a single ventilator into multiple patients, at least 2 patients. And we were asked to do these ventilator splitters. Typically, a medical device product takes like a couple of years to, from the beginning of the launch to get it to launch. We're able to use the technology to get it out in 10 days, so which is incredible and could not have happened without 3D printing. So I agree with Jennifer. There were definitely some, lot of learnings for us too, especially around how do we coordinate some of the standards around the technologies. But I think it was a big, impact to the patients during the crisis time. I think it really helped out. So.
And Ramon, what about you as, someone who's with a company that not only makes printers, but quite, uses 3D printing quite a lot as well?
Exactly. So I think that during this pandemic, we saw the limits of the current supply chain as we know it, which is fantastic, super efficient, but it works only when the supply is stable and the demand is stable. And what we've seen is actually both the supply broken in many cases with factories shut down, even countries being shut down, and also peaks on demand of areas that nobody actually could foresee. And one example is medical supplies. And so I think that the 3D community has done a fantastic job, really being together, working together, sharing designs, and really help through super quick reaction from idea and Jennifer and Sam just share some examples. Quick reaction from the identification of the need to the design to the production within weeks, showcasing the benefits of distributed manufacturing. Once you had an idea being certified, basically distributed files, printed, produced where it was needed, when it was needed, and also the ability to reconfigure production lines that were thought to produce product A, and suddenly, because the need was product B, basically shipped in to this production line to new SKUs, to new products that were needed. I think that this has been noticed by the industry, and now companies that are looking at a more resilient supply are taking notes of 3D printing, and we are having a lot of discussions with in different industries now on how we can help to think in a much better idea on resilient supply chain.
And Ramon, you mentioned all those benefits there, and we saw HP's technology being used for quite a lot of different applications over the course of the last year. Are there any applications from the pandemic that you think really stand out and kind of show 3D printing's capacity to help make supply chains more resilient and agile?
Yes, Laura. So let me give you a couple of examples. There's one example, for instance, on how quickly production lines were reconfigured. And the example is with one of our biggest customers, Smile Direct Lab, that within days, basically, they reconfigured their production lines that are basically, as you know, they produce dental liners to produce PPEs. And this was basically, they saw this peak in demand, they wanted to help, and basically within days, actually, a huge production line produced millions of dental liners a year was suddenly reconfigured to produce personal protection equipment. Another example of a fast reaction is swabs. I still remember there was weeks after the initial pandemic where we received a call, actually our colleagues in the central HP labs in Palo Alto, they received a call from a hospital in the Boston area, the Harvard Medical Hospital, and basically they shared with us their problem. The swabs around the world were produced by very few providers. Some of them were shut down. One example of one big provider in Italy, and basically the industry needed to produce swabs very quickly. So, and remember, it was a Thursday. On Friday, actually, we had the first discussion with them to put basically what were the specifications. During the weekend, we produced certain designs. On Monday, we received feedback. By the end of that week, basically, the FDA gave the okay for a 3D printing part to be produced in one particular part, and within weeks, basically, there was the scale on production. So these, as some was saying, this basically would have taken years to do in the normal situations, and this was done in a few weeks. And for me, basically, the idea of sharing files, produce the mask shields, the bifurcators, the door handles, the mask, basically where they need it. I think it's fantastic, and I think that 3D printing not only has demonstrated that can work and on demand, personalized, distributed, as we've always know, but can help on the current supply chain, and basically the example is actually we help some of the biggest providers of respirators in Europe. This was the example of a provider in Europe to produce spare parts that basically they didn't have, while we were working on field respirators that were designed from zero ground to give response to, for instance, the crisis that we had here in Spain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. And the swabs are such a good example of that, I think, as well, of just showing how 3D printing can be used in that mass manufacturing environment when the application really calls for it. But moving away from those kind of, I guess, pandemic-related types of components, companies have engineered their current supply chains featuring conventional manufacturing techniques, producing excess parts to store in inventory from offshore locations for reasons that have really made sense for their business up until now. But taking those things into account, why do you think it's important that manufacturers should consider 3D printing for their supply chains now? Sam, I'm going to point that to you.
Awesome, thank you, Laura. Yeah, I think it's a unique opportunity what a 3D printing can do in additive manufacturing. One is it can bring personalization to customers in the local regions. You know, instead of mass manufacturing things, we are set up to do that and deliver those standard products to customers. 3D printing can really enable that localized, portable technology that can serve the regions and customer needs in a local manner. So that's one big advantage. The other one is an overall end-to-end cost from this technology is a lot lower compared to the traditional ones, and able to create complex designs and can be done at a lower cost would really benefit any industry, any segment for that matter, serving those customers. And then lastly, I would also say that it's a very sustainable platform from a green and environmental perspective, the lower wastage and so on and so forth. So I think, irrespective of what industry we are in, I'm in mostly the medical device and pharmaceuticals, but I see the benefits can be translated broadly, and we should all consider 3D printing as we move into new products and new type of platforms. So.
Okay. Jennifer, what about you? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, for me, it's fascinating because profit-making firms are driven by this flexibility, this ability to relocate where they're producing in order to maximize profit. And now we've seen a disruption to that in which the calculations are somewhat different. And I think that is putting a pressure towards regionalizing or localizing their supply chains. And I think we have seen a pressure to reduce inventory since the 1990s. We saw just-in-time technologies coming from Japan. But I think that it's been slow to naturally progress on. And now I think the fixed cost of having that inventory stored are becoming too much. And that very difficult decision of where to store all these items. And it's actually warehousing is actually a very complicated issue in terms of how that fits in together with your supply chain. So I think 3D printing offers a very easy solution from that, once you understand the technology and how it can fit into your existing supply chain. I think that we are seeing greater consideration of distributed manufacturing, relocalization of where we produce. And the archetypal example for additive manufacturing is spare parts. And we've seen that is one of the classic examples used to illustrate really quite transformative impacts that can have. I think then it's up to the sector really to tackle some of those issues around IP and security around parts design and how we transfer those. But I'd also like to echo Sam's point about sustainability, and that speaks to a bigger, broader agenda, a governmental agenda, a consumer agenda about where we're actually sourcing from. And then our focus becomes on the material supply chains, and hopefully that's easier to have a greater handle over traceability around the materials, and also who's involved in the production of these items as well.
Okay. And Ramon, what about you?
I think that through the question, Laura, you've actually described very well the current manufacturing paradigm, which if you look at really why and how do we manufacture is really it responds to basically to the fact that the most important today manufacturing technologies, they all require very important fixed costs. In the case of plastic, injection molding requires a mold. And because it requires a mold, we are living in a paradigm of central production, because actually you have a mold, which is physical and it's only in one place, of mass production, because the more that you produce, the more that you amortize this fixed cost, and of generic products, because again, the mold produces the thing that basically the cavity is meant to do. And 3D printing, what basically is meant, and one of the big advantages basically to have the potential to change this paradigm from this essential mass production generic products to distributed on demand and personalized products. And for me, it not only enables what the typical person on the street would think about, which is basically, yes, you can do more efficient designs, or you can do these short runs. But I think that the key is that it enables a new business model. When you think really of what is the fundamental thing on 3D printing, is one, it helps on the demand-supply matching. And this is a huge deal. When basically you are a company that has a number of SKUs, really matching demand and supply is super, super difficult. So instead of producing and then praying that basically what you have produced, where you have put it, is going to sell, is basically to the stream, actually wait until you sell and then produce very near to where the demand is, and produce basically what the demand actually wanted. The other one, and for me is one of the biggest megatrends that we see moving forward, is the concept of the segment of one. The basically how to produce high value added products that are meaningful to one person. And for this, 3D printing, but also many other technologies are coming together in the factory to enable this idea of high mix, high volume. Today, basically the factories that we know produce high volume, low mix, and there are some other factories that produce low volume, high mix. The idea to produce high mix, high volume is something that the 3D printing, again, with other different technologies, are putting together, and I think is going to be one of the big changes on manufacturing on the next years. Okay.
And Jennifer, you spoke a lot about these opportunities, as I mentioned at the start in your talk at TCT at Formnext Connect, and also in a column which you wrote for TCT magazine at the start of the year. Can you elaborate on some of the complexities and challenges that you see when we're talking about reshoring manufacturing?
Yeah, I mean, reshoring actually is a quite complex process itself. Just as a firm would have different reasons for offshoring and do those differently, the reasons why firms might reshore can also vary as well. So we're not necessarily always seeing a return of like for like production. So a lot of the political rhetoric that we're getting around reshoring is let's bring back manufacturing back to advanced economies from low cost locations. And actually, of course, it's a lot more complicated than the politicians would lead us to believe. In industry, we know that. It may be that a firm actually reconsiders entirely how they produce those products that they're going to reshore, and which I think is a very clear opportunity for additive manufacturing. And also their cost calculations may be rather different. They would have an incentive to increase automation of production in order to reduce labor costs to mitigate the higher labor costs in the advanced economy. So we will see, I think, substantial shifts in the kinds of things that are coming back. And it might not just be things coming back. I think one element of reshoring actually should include preventing perhaps the production of some things going overseas and staying in the home countries. And we do see now increasingly, because of additive, of course, more prototyping happens at home, but we can see additive contributing in further ways, particularly around tooling and saving on tooling costs as well. So I think that also the supply relationships themselves are very complex. We know from, for example, the UK legislation on the Modern Slavery Act, we know that some companies are very, very limited in their knowledge of their suppliers past the first tier. So when firms are asked about their second tier and third tier suppliers, we end up in an unknown world. Well, where do they come from? So we can see that how the firms then take out some of their tiers and then reintegrate them back into their home countries can be rather different. I also don't think that reshoring necessarily means coming back to the home country. It could be that we see more return on a regional scale. So we could have more European companies, for example, leaving low-cost locations in Asia and returning to Europe as a whole. And I won't go into Brexit and how that might affect the UK because I'll get too upset. I think challenges are around how firms make these calculations. There's increasing acknowledgement that perhaps the calculations are too simple. You need to consider risk factors more and quality factors. There's some concerns around how to source more local suppliers. Reshoring UK is a very good initiative that is trying to match up firms that have supply needs with local suppliers. They do that through their body of trade associations. But also to think about some of the opportunities that might be available through incentives, but cautiously not engage too much with the political rhetoric about how and why this should be happening. I think that in the case of AM, we can contribute a really strong rationale for helping with the reshoring process.
Okay. So we know it's very complex and it comes with a lot of challenges, but there are, of course, a lot of advantages to potentially taking this option and using additive manufacturing within the supply chain. And I just wanted to put it to the entire panel. What do you see as the biggest opportunities for additive manufacturing as companies attempt to make their supply chains more flexible and more resilient? Ramon, I'll put it to you first.
In general, actually, and this I don't know if it's well known, but during the pandemic, actually we've seen an acceleration, a very important acceleration of the usage of the 3D printings and the install base of the 3D printers that we have. In a moment where investment in capital equipment has been frozen, actually, if you look at the usage of now I'm talking about HP on our industrial printers has been really looking at a huge increase in usage. And for me, this is a consequence of basically this idea of a more resilient way to produce. At least the companies and that had invested in 3D technology and 3D production plants, they've been able to maximize the production from sectors that you probably could guess. We have examples on consumer goods, in automotive, in industrial, but also some that you couldn't have guessed. And one of the things that we've seen recently is basically the packaging world, the fiber-based packaging, which is now again aligned with another mega trend, which is sustainability. For me, at the end, adoption is always a function of two things. It's the value proposition that additive and 3D printing brings, but also the awareness of this value proposition. And this pandemic has been really a big amplification of the 3D advantages. And the advantages that we all know in healthcare, like personalization and performance on consumer goods, around again the supply-demand matching, personalization, etc. All of this you have to piled on top the part of resiliency, and because I think that a lot of companies have been realizing actually that the best supply chain is the one that actually is able to deliver a product versus maybe a very low cost one that sometimes you're not able to produce and deliver the product. So I think that we've seen many examples of industries, applications popping up, and for me, what is more important is basically this awareness of the value proposition is being raised.
I think that's such an important point that you raised there, and I'm really glad that you said that, because I think that being close to the 3D printing industry, we've seen this kind of increase in conversation around 3D printing being used over the last year, but it's about whether people are going to take that now and actually use it for other applications that are not related to the pandemic, that are about building better supply chains and making them more resilient, and using 3D printing for different products now that they've seen the advantages. So it's great to hear that at HP you have seen this kind of increase in the use of your machines. Sam, what about you? What's your take on the kind of biggest opportunities for 3D printing?
Yeah, I think, just kind of reflecting on what Ramon said, right? I think the pandemic has really did teach us a couple lessons. One is, eventual nationalization and, some of the borders getting closed out. We need to be proactive about how we can make our supply chains more robust, that we can serve the local customers. So 3D printing naturally falls very well into serving that, regional local needs. So it fits very well. The other area which kind of became very evident is that the pandemics are going to, potentially could become part of our life moving forward. And this whole touchless supply chains, how can we, continue to provide the supply chain value, agility, incorporating some of the touchless aspects of it. So, and in that area also, I think 3D printing can definitely bring a lot of value because it's in fact being a digital technology and also be able to be operated, lights out manner in certain areas and without much of the human contact. So in a combination of automation, even on the healthcare side, we see not just 3D printing, but in context with robotics, the Internet of Things, the other type of adjacent technologies, it's going to bring a lot more value moving into the thing. So I think people are starting to see that. To Ramon's point, I think bringing more awareness of applications, also the capabilities, what this platform can bring, it's going to be important moving forward. The other thing I want to say is that 3D printing, we need to think about that as a platform of technologies and not just have one technology, because it is the polymers, you have metals, you also have bioprinting and sensor printing. It is just kind of, it can bring solutions across the platform and just not just one area. So it is very, definitely multifaceted. It would be the right word for it. So
I think that's a really, really good point there, Sam. And Jennifer, what about you? Any other kind of thoughts on the opportunities for additive manufacturing?
I think that AM could potentially play a really strong role in helping us to kind of future-proof supply chains. I think perhaps we could have been quite complacent since the acceleration of globalization since the 1970s. We've been more interconnected and integrated than ever, and we thought that was an unstoppable train. And for many people, it's come as a bit of a shock that that has changed quite significantly, and we made terms like deglobalization are now being bandied around. So I think we've known that there is potential challenges ahead. We know that there's peak oil. We know environmental crises can impact on supply chains as well as pandemics. So I think that as Sam and Ramon have indicated, it's not plain sailing from now on, and AM can really play a role in that. I would hope that it become easier to sell additive manufacturing and the applications that it can offer. We have so many more case studies, more public case studies that people are willing to share now as a result of the pandemic. But I think we need to emphasize that it's not just a tool for crisis. It is something that can be integrated to be complementary to traditional methods and can help during periods of normal demand. It could be quite easy to bat away the significance of 3D printing during the crisis and say, well, that's not a typical situation, that's not a genuine business model. But I think that we've got enough evidence to counter that. And I think really just helping to question the status quo and make people aware of some of those vulnerabilities and the really strong role that additive could play in mitigating against them.
Sam, I want to go back to something that you said then about 3D printing having so many different facets, different types of 3D printing, whether you're talking about metals, polymers, or bioprinting. There's so many kind of flexible opportunities. For J&J, why is a flexible supply chain important, and what role do you foresee 3D printing playing in that at the company?
Yeah, I think when I started out the conversation, I brought about that the diversity of the business is the diversity of the customers we serve, right? So I think, we have the med device, which was the initial starting point for us, with a lot of personalized instruments, implants, things like that were produced. But we see that moving forward, talking about the platform technologies, personalized medicine, right, which is able to deliver specific dosage forms to a specific individual, is going to be, important, which would be really strongly enabled by 3D printing on the pharmaceutical side. So we're putting a lot of effort into that space. And then the other area is the bioprinting space, right? Instead of putting metal and polymer products into your body, how can we just reintroduce and put, printed organs and printed tissue augments that the natural things can come into you instead of a foreign object, and 3D printing can deliver that also. So I think the value of this technology is from a supply chain perspective, the capabilities can be built in multiple angles and able to serve diverse businesses. And Johnson & Johnson is a good example of it because it's a conglomerate of, various diverse businesses in that sense. So I think we have a lot of big hope and for this platform of technology to deliver value. So.
Okay. I want to put this question out to the entire panel. So say I'm a company that's looking to maybe introduce additive manufacturing into my supply chain. Are there any key considerations that you think a company like this would need to make when wanting to re-engineer their supply chain and think about introducing something like 3D printing? Ramon, I think we'll go to you first.
I think that one of the things that you need to think when thinking about the supply chain, think about the resiliency, is that the resiliency of a supply chain is the resiliency of the worst part of your supply chain. And what is which is actually a good practice to do is what actually, if you remember, on Europe during the financial crisis, there was this stress test to the banks. And there was basically this different test that you need to stress your banking system to see basically is your bank robust. The same thing in supply chain. We need to make sure that we test actually our supply chains with these vectors of tests that simulate different conditions and see really what is the true resiliency of the supply chain. And what is very important also at the end, when you look at doing new things to your supply chain, is have a very good business case. And I think that Jennifer was pointing this before. It's very important to take all the costs, not a simplistic model. Look at the hidden costs. There's so many hidden costs, and really going to a much more robust supply chain, one that actually can be more supportive of different variations, and it's not that the companies didn't have it. All of us had our business continuity plans. HP had the business continuity plans. Most of them actually failed miserably because we didn't put the different or a lot of under enough stress to really look good.
That's really interesting, and I'm glad you're being so honest about that as well. Jennifer, what about you? Any key considerations you think a company would need to have in order to introduce additive manufacturing?
Well, I think it depends how familiar the company is already with AM and if they've been using it already for prototyping, for example. And I think I would probably encourage confidence in the technology, but also to veer from initially starting with the sexiest case study that you might want to publicize and do some of the groundwork and become familiar with that technology. I mean, there's a lot of work that can happen around tooling, around jigs and fixtures, and really considering it quite a long learning process. I mean, it needn't necessarily be particularly long in time, but I think that there's a various stages that you can go through in order to build confidence with what you're trying to do. We're constantly bombarded with all these amazing things that can happen, and actually there's quite a lot of mundane everyday tasks that additive can perform that can really help a firm's performance and improve their supply chain. A second point really would be around making sure you have the right people to help you introduce this technology. It's not necessarily easy to find the right people to help you run your additive machines, but they are out there. But to be aware that you need to find them and integrate them into your company in order to get the best out of the technology, because the technology is nothing without the right people in order to know how to use it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, two really great points there. It's all about the people, and you're so right about looking for those kind of less interesting but super useful applications to start off with. I think that really is key. And Sam, what about you? As a company that has actually adopted additive manufacturing in various different ways, any key considerations that maybe you had to take that you would recommend to a company thinking about introducing 3D printing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, prototyping and, the low-hanging fruit on the tree is definitely an area to start with, like what Jennifer was talking about. But one of the biggest advantage of 3D printing is able to deliver some complex designs, right? So it doesn't matter what industry you are in, if you go back and revisit what the customer wants and what the needs are, and rethink this technology to see, can this deliver more than what we are giving them already, right? A lot of these products can be, readjusted, redesigned so that the cost can be significantly lower, but also deliver what the customers are wanting. So that's an advantage of this. And sometimes when we, call the 3D printing as just a manufacturing technology, we do injustice, right? It is something which can play a bigger role in really bringing that really unthinkable designs in a combination with this very agile supply chain manufacturing technology that it can deliver. So that would be my advice, that go back to the ground zero to think about what your customer wants. Is this a value? What I can, use this technology to bring that back to them.
Sam's reminded me of a really important point around additive, is that ability to actually reduce the number of components that you need. So you can actually decrease the complexity of your supply chain, which makes it easier to manage as well.
So we've got a couple of questions left now, and Sam, I'm going to bring this one back to you again as a user of 3D printing technology. What can the additive manufacturing sector do you think, to improve the solutions delivered to the market and ensure that the technology is robust enough for manufacturers to really lean on?
Yeah, I think we have come a long way, right? I think if you look at a decade ago, when we were doing manufacturing, we were more on the polymer side, doing prototypes, non-mission critical components. But if you see now, I think we definitely have improved our technology from the machinery and the printers themselves have gotten a lot more robust. The material characterization and type of raw material, the resins and the powders, have substantially improved in the quality and also on standardization aspects of it. So I think over the next a generation of things, these are going to get a lot more robust. The standards are going to be a lot more clear. The regulatory bodies and the agencies are going to be a lot more aware of what's going to come out of that. I think this is a good future for the combination of it. This will also drive the complexity, like what Jennifer was talking about, but also would bring very competitive cost across in the metals and polymers and other areas to moving us forward. So it's a good thing for us to in this journey where we are in. So
okay. And Ramon, what about you? You're building these machines, but also using them day in, day out. What kind of improvements do you think could be made by the sector?
I think that the sector can improve in many different vectors, and I mean, I will not be sharing anything super confidential, saying that basically all of us are really looking into improving how actually you can introduce these industrial 3D printers seamlessly in a factory and being a digital citizen of this industry 4.0 factory, improving economics, obviously, increasing the application and breadth. But for me, the one of the most important things beyond basically the technological improvement, which there will be and will be actually significant, is how do we make sure that we convey to our customers and to the people that adopt that basically a 3D printer is not a green button. It's not basically something that you put, file, print, but basically it requires some production engineer, some engineer, some quality management system, some design for manufacturability, the usual things that all of the engineers are trained, that basically you need for different technologies. For 3D printing, probably is much easier, but also you need to go through certain processes to make sure that when you go from design to scale production, you don't see some hiccups like sometimes today we see. So a lot of training, a lot of awareness on how important is this process development and this production development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. And it's about understanding that end-to-end process that goes into producing a finished part. Jennifer, what about you? Any thoughts on that?
I think there's still quite a lot of work to do around transparency, around business models that underpin this. I think there's quite a lot of work going on within companies and within 3D printing companies, and a bit more knowledge exchange could happen. I know that's difficult in competitive sectors at difficult times, but I think that it does have an impact on users and can potentially be quite confusing sometimes for them. I think some reassurance around stability of material supply as well, I think would be important. I think that can be quite a significant consideration for manufacturers when they're thinking about using 3D printing.
Okay, thank you. So before we wrap up now, can we have some final thoughts from each of you, or any key takeaways about AM and supply chain? So Jennifer, we'll go back to you first.
I thought long and hard about this because I found it quite an interesting question, and actually I ended up feeling quite emotional about the rhetoric that surrounds additive. And when I first started doing research on this sector, a lot of the talk was around how transformative it was and how it's going to change the world for the better. And as I engaged more with people like yourselves, it became very clear to me that it was a complementary tool, and it was a tool like every other, and that it could be used alongside conventional manufacturing. And I think that came about as a kind of pushback against all this transformative rhetoric in order to carve out market share, essentially. But I'm inclined now to encourage us all to ignite a bit more of that initial enthusiasm and confidence in the technology. It is potentially transformative. It might be a tool, but it's a very special tool, and it's got some amazing capabilities. And I think that the contemporary situation, as difficult it is, has really highlighted those capabilities, and push a bit harder on actually the technology. Now we have so much confidence in what it can do and the impact that it could have.
And Sam, what about you? Any final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I think like I said, it's a platform of technology, and I think from a talent perspective, we need to be open in our thinking, right? Or from engineers and scientists, that this can deliver a lot of value, in transformative in many areas. We take advantage of it in a lot of simple manner, like prototyping and stuff like that. But there is a potential, if we can think beyond what we're doing day in and day out, that this can bring a lot of value in it. So, which we have seen in my company, that it just has started opening up the applications for the patients in areas we would never thought about in the past. So it's a very powerful one, and I'm looking forward to expanding it in the community. So
great. And Ramon, any final thoughts from you?
Sure. For me, 3D printing has the potential to change the way people design and manufacture. Design in the sense of producing new products that were not possible before, products that are more personal, more meaningful to the end customers, and changing also the way that is manufactured. Is changing actually who, how, and where these goods are produced. And this has actually profound implications. From one side is democratization, if you think about of the access to production tools, but also has the potential to reconfigure value chains, supply chains, has the potential to accelerate disintermediation, and I think that has the potential really to change the industrial and manufacturing landscape on the next 5 to 10 years. So very exciting to be part of this change, and actually see how people really take advantage of these tools to not only produce new products and to optimize production, but really rethink their whole business model.
I think that's a really positive and hopeful note to end on. So thank you all so much for your insights today. I think it's been a really great discussion. Thanks so much.